One of the core principles of pricing is that you price on value as opposed to pricing on cost. Like, one of the worst things you can do is price your cost and then add some margin on top. The best thing you can do is deeply understand your product's value to the end customer and then price against that value. What we see is that it's very difficult for companies to evolve and iterate on pricing and packaging across hybrid pricing models, across hybrid sales motions, across multiple products. Because of architectural issues, the way we handle what are called entitlements is often very much an anti-pattern.
Is this a problem when companies scale, or do you feel that, even in early stage, people are not able to be as agile about pricing as they should be?
So we typically serve scale-up or mid-market companies. These are companies that have usually gotten to product market fit. They're starting to become more complex. And it's also increasingly a startup problem. What we notice is more startups are going hybrid pricing.
So why do so many companies or so many early DevTool teams actually hardcode billing logic directly into their application?
I think in one hand, like when you have very few customers and you've got simple pricing, hard coding it is easy. And what you're kind of biasing for is speed and survival at that stage. I think the second reason is the existing infrastructure and tools have not articulated a standard for how to handle entitlements. What I see from the companies that are really turning pricing and packaging into a growth lever is that they actually...
Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss a problem that almost every DevTool company runs into, often much earlier than expected, which is billing. Billing sounds very simple to begin with, right? You charge per seat, per usage, and maybe add in a couple of tiers. But as DevTools continue to grow, billing becomes one of the hardest systems to change and one of the biggest blockers of GTM velocity. To unpack why this happens and what can teams do to avoid painful rewrites, I'm joined today by Fynn Glover, who's the founder of Schematic, a company which works with DevTool teams as they scale billing, usage, and feature access. Fynn, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time today to speak to us.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Fynn, so before we begin and get into billing, would love to understand your background and what led you to start Schematic.
My background, I've mostly been a founder and an operator. I started my first company in 2011 and ran that company for most of the next 10 years. We did a lot. We pivoted from services to SaaS. We built sales, marketing, success. We raised angel capital, we raised venture capital, we pivoted, we got pricing right, we got pricing very wrong, we were eventually acquired, and after that company I joined a Series C cybersecurity company that was growing quite quickly, and I managed pricing and packaging was one of my remits, and I sort of experienced firsthand how difficult it was for a scaling business truly leverage and control pricing and packaging, to make pricing and packaging sort of an extension of the product, to evolve and iterate on pricing and packaging continuously. That experience led me to getting very curious about the underlying technical and architectural constraints, which led to the founding of Schematic in June of 2023. So we've been building Schematic for about 2.5 years now.
And how's it been for you building Schematic?
Great. I think if you think about B2B monetization, actually quite a boring subject for the last 15 years. And the reason for that is it just didn't change much. It was static and seat-based pricing or billing. And over the last 2 years, obviously that has changed meaningfully. Effectively, what's happening is AI is, of course, changing that dynamic. And the reason it's changing the dynamic is AI is forcing companies to operationalize new realities, certainly on their underlying costs, which are far less predictable. But more than that, AI is forcing companies to reassess how they align pricing with value. And so what you see is not just a shift from seat-based pricing to usage-based pricing. That's a simple way to look at it. What you really see is a shift from seat-based pricing to lots of different flavors of hybrid pricing, not to mention multiple go-to-market motions and multi-product offerings. And so, the way we operationalize pricing and packaging across that type of complexity, hybrid billing, hybrid selling, multi-product, is actually quite difficult.
And other teams catching up, do you feel that now a lot of hybrid pricing is happening? And if you could unpack hybrid pricing a bit, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, sure. So it sort of is another proxy for saying something like multimeter. But one of the core principles of pricing is that you price on value as opposed to pricing on cost. Like, one of the worst things you can do is price your cost and then add some margin on top. The best thing you can do is deeply understand your product's value to the end customer and then price against that value. And so traditionally, one of the best ways to understand your value was to select a price metric or a value metric that was intuitive to the customer. And I'll try to make that really clear. Like, in the days of seats, right? A seat was very intuitive to the end customer on this is how this product's value will expand. The more people using the product, the more the value expands, therefore we're happy to pay more. But when you move into a world of hybrid or usage-based, what you start to introduce are new value metrics and, in fact, multiple value metrics. And it is sort of embedded in this idea of multiple value metrics that you find hybrid pricing, which can come in many different flavors. Like, for example, one example of hybrid pricing would be a platform fee plus usage, or another example would be like usage-based tiers, or volume discounts, or usage fees with a spend cap, or platform fee plus a success fee. Like, you can rattle off like 10 different flavors of hybrid pricing, but what it comes down to are multiple metrics of value that are driving the price for the customer.
No, I think that context is really helpful. And Fynn, for people who might not be aware, how would you explain what Schematic does in really simple terms?
Yeah, well, I think the way I'll start is just by articulating some of the problems that companies run into. So when you think about a company that is kind of trying to support hybrid pricing and maybe trying to support hybrid pricing across a sales-led motion as well as a product-led motion and maybe across multiple products, what you run into is a lot of permutation potential, a lot of SKUs. And what companies increasingly want to do is they want to be able to experiment and iterate on pricing and packaging and evolve pricing and packaging rapidly so that they're learning faster, and also so that they can effectively align pricing and packaging with ongoing product maturation. It's a huge missed opportunity to spend 2 years of product and engineering investment and then not adjust pricing and packaging at all, because now your pricing and packaging lags the value you've created. So what we see is that it's very difficult for companies to evolve and iterate on pricing and packaging across hybrid pricing models, across hybrid sales motions, across multiple products. Because of architectural issues, the way we handle what are called entitlements is often very much an anti-pattern. And so an entitlement is what should someone be able to do in an application? Should they be able to access a feature or exceed a limit or add a seat that historically companies have hard-coded into their application and then tried to tie to plan IDs in the billing system. And the moment that happens, a type of painful commercial and technical debt is kicked off that's very hard to recover from. And so what Schematic is trying to do is solve those problems, decouple entitlements from application code so that commercial personas and product and RevOps can, with a great degree of agility, control pricing and packaging, not simply from the launch of a new pricing model, but for the day-to-day lifecycle management of a customer.
Understood. And what stage of companies do you work with? Is this a problem when companies scale, or do you feel that even in early stage people are not able to be as agile about pricing as they should be?
It's a great question. So we typically serve what I would describe as like scale up or mid-market companies. These are companies that have usually gotten to product market fit. They're starting to become more complex. Maybe they're introducing hybrid pricing, or they're introducing hybrid selling, or they're going multi-product. But this is a problem that exists across market segments. It's absolutely an enterprise problem, and it's also increasingly a startup problem. What I would say is, what we notice is more startups are going hybrid pricing and wanting to be more iterative earlier in their life cycle than they used to be when the world was largely seat-based.
Understood. You mentioned that a lot of problems sort of comes because of hard coding billing logic. So why do so many companies or so many early DevTool teams actually hard code billing logic directly into their application?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think in one hand, like when you have very few customers and you've got simple pricing, hard coding it is easy. And what you're kind of biasing for is speed and survival at that stage. You're not biasing for the cleanest possible architecture. And so that's one reason, is like you're trying to survive. This is easy, this is fast, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. That's a big part of it. I think the second reason is the existing infrastructure and tools have not articulated a standard for how to handle entitlements. And that's something that Schematic hopes to contribute to is, hey, there is a great way to do this architecturally that's clean and scalable and great application design from the very beginning.
Understood. And when you say hard-coded, what does that actually look like in a real code base? And what would technical debt be?
I wish I could share a screen here. So what you're looking at, right, is like entitlements data that is, it lives in the billing system, it might live in your code. It's effectively these if-then conditionals based on what the customer got that the engineer has had to consider and that the engineer has hard-coded. And so what's the implication of this? Well, anytime the business wants to go make changes, whether they are really big changes, like we're going to introduce an entire new pricing model with credits and new price metrics, to like a really simple change, like we're going to grant an exception on this enterprise deal because they're an enterprise and we need to get them across the line. You got to come back into the code and you have to make the changes here. And what this looks like when you have decoupled all of this is it looks much cleaner, right? Like you're putting all of this billing logic behind this centralized entitlement check that works like a feature flag. And so what it allows the developer to do is simply ask this service, can the user do this? Can they exceed this limit? Things like that. And it's basically a separation of concerns. Now the application doesn't have to know about all of this billing state, which it shouldn't have to know. It can just ask Schematic or ask the entitlement service that you build in-house.
Understood. So once someone, starts working with Schematic, what is the first step and how do you actually help them, clean up their billing logic so that it's more sustainable, more agile?
It's really quite straightforward. So we integrate deeply with billing platforms. Most importantly, we're deeply integrated with Stripe. And effectively what you do is you connect Stripe. That imports all your customers into Schematic and all your products. Then you set up features and plans in Schematic. So I like to think about features or entitlements as sort of the atomic unit for how you want to monetize your product. And what you do in Schematic is you create 3 types of features. One could be a sort of a Boolean feature, on or off. One could be an event-based feature, which might be like something like API requests that you're tracking and metering against. One could be like a trait-based feature, which might increment or decrement, for example, a seat. Are you going to add 5 seats in this month and then subtract 2 next month? So you can create these features in Schematic, entitle them to plans, and now you've got a product catalog, and any change that you make in Schematic kicks off a change that propagates in your application to correct access, and also a change downstream into the billing tool to ensure correct invoicing.
Got it. And which use case do you see, happening the most across the companies that you work for?
What we see is basically like there are kind of 3 very kind of like core value pillars. The first is for engineering. You now do not need to build and maintain a robust and decoupled entitlement service. You've offloaded that. And what that does is it basically allows you to centralize how you manage customer state. That's very important. And the second piece is more for commercial personas. And so what commercial personas are trying to do with Schematic is generally 2 things. One is launch new pricing, experiment with pricing. This might be introduce a new price model. And that might take place a few times a year, depending on how fast they're shipping. For example, a very common use case is I need to understand which of my customers are overusing the product but underpaying relative to other customers so that I can go try to expand them. Or this customer's hit a limit. I need to alert sales that it's time to go have a conversation. It's all kinds of little jobs like this that allow you to leverage packaging to drive more expansion out of your customer base.
Understood.
What we often talk to companies about is like, well, how should I approach pricing and packaging from like a strategic perspective? And the second question that we're always handling as well, how should I architect pricing and packaging so that from an infrastructure perspective, we're super agile? And so what I would say is, to answer the first question, what I see from the best companies, the companies that are really turning pricing and packaging into a growth lever, is that they actually view pricing and packaging as something that they should be good at. They sit there and they say to themselves, we should be as good at pricing and packaging as we are at sales or engineering or product or customer success. Like, it is that important. When they have that type of commitment, what I then start to see them do is sort of incorporate in almost like a practice or a function several things. One is they continuously go out and have willingness to pay conversations with the market. they're constantly pressure testing their value. The second thing is that they establish pricing principles that are aligned with their stage. Because if they don't have principles, they can be really reactive and inconsistent. The third is that they make pricing conversations like a legitimate habit. They have monthly meetings to discuss what they have learned from the market about their pricing and their packaging. And that kind of translates finally into they're committed to aligning their core product roadmap with a pricing and packaging roadmap. They want those two things operating in sync because they believe it will make them more money. So that's the strategic side, and that's the best practice I see.
It's not like, every year you're sort of figuring out what your pricing should be, or, per feature, this is what the pricing should be. You're also understanding what the market is doing, what is it that they're using, and then basing your pricing based on that.
That's right, exactly. And I think we are coming from a world where many companies left a lot of money on the table because they did not treat pricing and packaging as this core muscle to be exercised continuously. And I think that what that means is companies that really treat pricing and packaging as a discipline will grow faster and be more competitive and be faster to iterate and learn.
Got it. But Fynn, how does the market react, when you're changing your pricing so often, or if you're including new tiers? Do they see any pushback because their pricing is continuously evolving? Or is that something that the market accepts because the product is also evolving?
Great question. So I think the answer is yes, the market accepts continuous iteration. However, what I would say is if every 3 months you make a massive change to list price or price metric, that could be damaging. Whereas if every month you make a change to packaging because your product got better, that's very positive. That distinction is very important, and I'm happy to elaborate on it.
That was supposed to be my next question. If you could sort of elaborate on what you mean by packaging and how is that different?
Yeah. So let's imagine you're selling B2B software to enterprises, and you've got a pricing page, and that pricing page has 3 tiers. And let's say your sales rep is trying to close an enterprise deal, and that enterprise customer is familiar with the pricing on your pricing page. And let's say that enterprise deal takes 3 months to close. And let's say you're getting farther along in the deal, and then 2 months in, the customer sees this big change to your price, like the actual list price. And they also see a big change to your value metric, like you've gone from seats to credits. Well, now that negotiation is at risk, especially if there's been poor communication. And so that's why major pricing changes, like the actual price or the price metric, happen far less frequently than packaging changes. Because if you're shipping new features all the time, you in theory should be adding new features into the enterprise tier, pulling enterprise features back into the startup and growth tier. Your packaging can change all the time, as it should, whereas your pricing, like the actual price point, might change less often.
Got it. For your packaging changes, you're saying that even if it's like a monthly sort of shift, that's something that the market accepts because the product is evolving.
That's exactly right.
Got it. And the second question, Fynn, you were saying, how do they think about pricing from an infrastructure perspective so that they can be more agile? So if you could elaborate on that.
The pattern that most companies start out with is they implement their billing tool, Stripe or ChargeBee or whatever, and then they have their application know the billing state of the customer, meaning they've hard-coded the entitlements. And this is not good application design because it tightly couples billing state, billing logic in your application and basically kicks off that cycle of commercial and technical debt because pricing and packaging will inevitably change all the time, many times for the rest of the business's life cycle, meaning you're always going to have to go in there as a developer and support the next billing or pricing iteration. And so whenever you kind of get into a billing implementation and you accept this inflexible pattern of having billing state be known by the application, what you're doing is you're making it really hard to evolve pricing and packaging and support customer exceptions as your product grows. A much better way to do that is to either build a decoupled entitlement service or buy a decoupled entitlement service so that your application does not have to know the billing state of the customer. That's the key point to set your pricing and monetization architecture up for scaling.
So what does this clean architecture look like? So I understood, buying a decoupled sort of service, but if one were to build it, how does it look like?
The thing that you're trying to do, right, is you're trying to build a service or buy a service that, effectively can describe entitlements and evaluate entitlements and enforce them in the product at runtime. That's what you're trying to do.
Got it. And you see a lot of companies now doing this. Is there like enough awareness about the agility of and the importance of pricing, or do you feel that this is something that companies are still catching up to?
I think it's both. So I think what we have learned is there's an enormous amount of pressure up and down the stack, companies of all sizes, to figure out hybrid pricing. And if you think about the reason for that, it's effectively like, it's kind of twofold, right? It's like, you could dumb it down to like, well, AI is making everybody go do hybrid pricing, right? But what's really happening is software is becoming more probabilistic, which means variable outputs and costs at runtime, rather than deterministic, where the same inputs like yielding the same result. That makes static seat-based pricing break down. And so in response, like every company is having to figure out how to adopt hybrid pricing, usage-aware models, not just because they're trying to protect margins, that's one part of this, but it's really so that they can align price with value and maintain control as software becomes more dynamic. More companies are starting to realize that they're running into all these kind of flexibility problems. And when they reach out to us, what we often find is they're kind of blaming their billing product. They're like, our billing product isn't flexible enough. And what we often find ourselves doing is helping them understand, well, actually, this might not be a billing problem. This might be an entitlements problem. This might be how you've implemented monetization in your code. And most of the time, that is the problem.
Understood. And is this like the biggest problem that you see in pricing that companies make, or the biggest mistake that they make?
Oh man, I think it's those two. It's like either they don't treat pricing as a discipline to excel at as a business. That's a strategic missed opportunity. And then secondly, they don't think about pricing as this full architecture that must be able to interact with their product, their billing, their quoting. And so they end up with all these silos and then unable to iterate. Those are the two common problems.
Understood. So someone, who's starting a DevTool, what would your piece of advice be for them, when they're thinking about billing?
So there are lots of good billing tools. I think my main advice to them would be, when you set up the billing tool that you choose, do not hard code entitlements. Like, do not ask your application to be sort of the source of truth for billing state, because it will just make your life miserable as you grow and as your product becomes more complex. And it's very easy to solve that problem in the early days. It can be quite expensive if you get to 10, 20, $50 million in revenue and you've got multiple products and thousands of customers to go unwind that. So, many companies end up with like large billing engineering teams because of this.
Understood. No, I think this is quite insightful, because I don't think, from what I'm understanding, is that billing is one of those things that teams don't really think about enough until it starts becoming a bottleneck. So I think this is really helpful. And I think thinking about pricing as a discipline is something that is fairly new and something that I hadn't thought of. So super insightful, Fynn. Thank you so much for sharing this.
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great questions. We just released a book, so much of what we've discussed is packaged in that book, and you can read it in under an hour and get basically everything that we've learned about pricing and packaging across 10 years of operating, 10, 15 years of operating.
Perfect. What's the book name? We'll at least make sure that we link it when we're sort of releasing this episode.
It's called You're Leaving Money on the Table.
Oh, a very interesting title.
I think it's a really useful read, and it will touch on kind of the two core things we talked about, which was like, how do you make pricing a discipline, and then how do you architect pricing for flexibility. Thank you so much. Great to be with you. Appreciate it again.